I'd like to thank Drs. Del Tufo for their service and their sponsoring of this event. I'd like to thank the Delaware Humanities Council and the University of Delaware for hosting. I've been time traveling for the better part of 10 years. As a historian, you get the opportunity to go into the past. And so this evening, I wanted to share a few things I've brought back with me from my travels. Some of it will be language, some of it will be artifacts, and everything in aggregate will be in an effort to try to get us to think through a little bit of our own kind of hardwiring and our set of shared narratives and assumptions about segregation, about American politics and power, and about our place in the telling of American history. Now, the first thing that I like to do, just to make things a little more real, is to bring a kind of hard artifact from the past. Now, these kinds of signs were integral to the infrastructure of Jim Crow America. And when you see this image or this item, this artifact, it brings you immediately into another world. Now, these items, and there's a whole kind of secondary market in the selling of Jim Crow ephemera. Part of what jars us about them is that they're not really supposed to be out and about anymore. These are troublesome things. And part of what I want us to think about this evening is, what do we think about or believe when we see this or any other kind of marker from the Jim Crow era? Now, we have a set of ideas, things that we think we know about the Jim Crow era. One of them is that Jim Crow segregation was imposed by whites onto black people, and that blacks had no choice in the matter. And choice is obviously a very complicated thing, and I want to spend some time unpacking that. The second thing that we think we know is that segregation was too expensive to maintain. If you had to build a colored-only waiting room, you had to also build a whites-only waiting room. And that there was a kind of shelf life to Jim Crow that was going to run out once you realized that you couldn't basically make separate but equal of everything. The third is that segregation ended through a combination of moral arguments and unsustainable economic costs. When these signs came down, it was the consequence of people winning debates in the public square. Very persuasive statements from iconic figures like Martin Luther King. We have heroic moments like Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in Montgomery, and a variety of other points of intersection that made it in everyone's best interest to basically take down the markers of Jim Crow. Now, part of what I'm going to try to discuss with you this evening is that once Jim Crow's infrastructure comes down, there are still a number of other pieces of Jim Crow's culture that remain. And they remain in part because of things that we had forgotten about how Jim Crow actually functioned in the day-to-day. The first is that segregation actually happens through interracial negotiation. You don't get a colored-only waiting room without there being politics behind it. Because believe it or not, the default response from most whites after the end of Reconstruction was exclusion, not segregation. You simply wouldn't have a waiting room for African Americans. It actually took work and labor, political lobbying and jockeying to simply get a colored-only anything, not just waiting rooms, water fountains, seats in stadiums, and so forth. And so what I want to submit to you this evening is to think through the negotiative part of Jim Crow America, and then to have us think a little bit about that in its afterlife. The second is that segregation is profitable. It is profitable. And I'm going to go into some detail a little bit this evening about all the different ways that one could make a tremendous amount of money from Jim Crow segregation. And again, to think about the afterlife of segregation as inherent in its profitability. Third, that segregation is ongoing. Now, this is an argument that sometimes I don't actually have to make, because people have a general sense of where they live and where their coworkers live and where they go to church. And there's a way that almost anecdotally you can describe the ongoing nature of segregation. But we tend to forget that there are very clear policy reasons why we live where we do, go to school where we do, think about the world in the ways that we do. And one of the things that has happened to us in our own thinking about Jim Crow is not just the losing of the overt signs of apartheid, but also a changing of Jim Crow's language. And so you're going to hear some language this evening that collapses that perceived distance we have between the current moment and the age of Jim Crow. We're actually going to explain a little bit in terms of how we got there and what some of the consequences there are. Now, in order to just begin a baseline understanding of the negotiative side of Jim Crow America, you have to appreciate the fact that many African Americans coming out of the 19th century had a profound appreciation for the power of property. The Constitution was terrible when it came to conveying voting as a positive right. It actually doesn't exist in the Constitution. If you go look today, there's nothing that says you have the right to vote. The 15th Amendment simply says that you cannot have your rights to vote taken away. It's not a positive right. Similarly, civil rights have to be written into the law of the land. It is not actually in the original version of the Constitution. There was an elaborate set of debates and arguments that had to happen in the antebellum period to determine whether or not black people were citizens at all, and then in Reconstruction with the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which simply tried to make good on what the earlier promise of civil rights had been. But the point is that property, of all the rights that one had, was really the most ironclad foundation of citizenship and rights. And so towns like Mount Bayou, Mississippi, or Boley, Oklahoma, became critical to the making of a black counterpublic. And entrepreneurs who worked in these enclaves went across the color line and worked with their white counterparts, again, to get Jim Crow's world built. The waiting rooms, the hospital beds, and so forth. You had to have representatives from the entrepreneurial class make claims about their own citizenship. And the ways in which they did this are really quite remarkable. You had some people, for instance, that would use their property tax receipts as freedom papers or as some kind of expression of them having paid into the community chest. And how can I not have a waiting room if I've in effect paid for one? How can I not have access to a park or a beach if I've already paid for one by virtue of me having paid my property taxes? So the very nature of the claims that one made in the Jim Crow era privileged those who had property. But there's also another piece of this equation, one that tends to surprise us. Most southern cities depended profoundly on the ability of black folk to in fact buy property and pay taxes on said property. They needed the money to build their roads and bridges, to do their different infrastructural improvements. Now what this basically means is that many African Americans could buy land that they were not allowed to live on. They could pay money into the community chest for real estate that racial zoning said they could not in fact occupy. What this does is it creates a deep contradiction at the heart of Jim Crow America, that you in fact had many black landlords who were renting to white tenants. This is an image of a deed. The name here is Dana A. Dorsey. He's a fourth grade educated African American entrepreneur who was born in southern Georgia, eventually acquired the amount of wealth that sustained oil wells, real estate, farmland in Cuba and a variety of other places in and around the Circum-Caribbean. Now, this is a lease where you have two gentlemen who are of Greek extraction renting from him, an A. Anthony and a Mr. Bogiages, and both of them paid like clockwork rent to Mr. Dorsey every Saturday. He went and collected in person. Now imagine this for a moment in a world of colored-only signs, that you in fact could have black people show up and let you know that the rent was due. In cities like Miami, Florida, or in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and many new South cities, African Americans who had the financial wherewithal to build an economic foundation didn't just have land that they rented to whites. They also had companies in which they employed white workers, in many cases, menial workers. And in fact, many of the moments of racial violence in and around the Jim Crow South were actually around points of employment and points of residence. And they were around conflicts between whites and blacks about the resources of Jim Crow and about Jim Crow's profitability. Rosewood, a community in Central Florida, was one that was attacked in 1923 because you had an affluent or more affluent black community under attack from its white neighbors. Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, another very famous pogrom in American history, where the Greenwood District, or Black Wall Street, was attacked by local whites. Now, what many folks don't know about Black Wall Street at the time was that you had so much oil money sloshing through Tulsa, Oklahoma, that many African Americans could, in fact, as professionals or as landowners, amass a tremendous amount of wealth. And so many of the acts of racial terrorism that included driving over 1,000 blacks from their homes were, in fact, white employees of black bosses who were attacking their employer as a way of flipping what should have been the normal order of Jim Crow America. They also burned down the houses and the records, because this is a time in which real estate records are not on computers. They're in file cabinets. They're under people's beds, right? And so when you burn down someone's home and you burn the record of their ownership of land that you might in fact occupy, it actually creates a mass property transfer from black to white hands. So in Tulsa, Oklahoma, what you in fact see is a surgical series of attacks on black ownership, many cases from their white tenants and employees, as a way of basically taking their property. And they took other things like record players and fur coats. There are FBI accounts that talk about whites taking African Americans' cars. I mean, this is a genuine riot situation, but one that was colored by the way in which the economy worked in Jim Crow America. At the same time, there was a political component to this. And I apologize if some of you might be disturbed by the image, but this is an extraordinarily important piece of how the afterlife of Jim Crow would ultimately work. Now, when lynching occurred in areas around the Jim Crow South or even in the West, it's important to understand its political content. Its political content. It was one thing to simply have an act of mob violence. It was another thing to talk about these acts as being the will of the masses, of the people, in fact, being sovereign. You only had lynchings in those areas where it was perceived that the normal workings of the government were not doing their job. The folks or the masses had to take the law into their own hands. And there were moments in America's history, like this one pictured here, where one could proudly display their expression of popular sovereignty without worrying about suffering from law enforcement. You take pictures and your face is figured prominently. Now, what's important to keep in mind about these moments is that this was seen as being an acceptable piece of American democracy and popular sovereignty. The notion that we, the people, are the ones who, in fact, imbue the state with its power would carry on even after, again, the Jim Crow signage came down. Now, what would happen in the South and in other corners of the country through the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s is that what we now understand to be kind of liberalism, the use of the state to regulate people's everyday activity, came in part on the question of lynching. It was about taking the mob leader and bringing him to heel under the authority of the government. So much of what becomes critical to the development of modern government oversight, politics, democracy, is about getting the state to basically take over the right to kill, to put the monopoly of violence in the hands of the government. So you move it from the lynch mob to the badge-wearing sheriff. You're not supposed to have mob violence. You're instead supposed to have something that is very, very orderly. Woodrow Wilson, a very well-known president and architect of Jim Crow segregation in the federal government, was in fact a large proponent of getting rid of lynching and letting the law do its job, because he believed that the barbarism of Southern whites was casting a bad image on the country, and he likened it in many respects to the barbarism he was seeing in Europe as he was waging World War I. Of course, you had many crusaders who understood that lynching itself came with a series of narratives. Ida B. Wells, a very well-known lynching crusader, tried to let it be known as far as she could that lynching was not a question of protecting the womanhood of white women or somehow keeping the black bestial rapist, under control, but it was instead driven by economic factors. She was in fact the first person to explicitly make this connection between political power, economic power, and the uses of mob violence to control these populations that were in danger of basically turning their commercial power into something more. At the same time that Ida B. Wells is waging her crusade, of course, many people are beginning to think about shadow institutions that in the wake of regulation can still do the work of white popular sovereignty. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, which really swelled to large roles and memberships after the creation of D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation. Part of their job was to basically preserve this thread of white popular sovereignty, to show that, in fact, the people were still sovereign, not the state. You weren't going to regulate the power of the masses. Now, as we move from the teens into the 20s, into the 30s, the government is taking a larger and larger role in helping to preserve aspects of American life. The Great Depression, which in so many respects was the great leveler to the property moment of the 19th century. So many people lost their homes. So many people found that they couldn't make ends meet. They had to have children, working, wives working with babe in arms, men who were out of work. So much went into trying to salvage the country. And Franklin Roosevelt, knowing that he had to make sure that he could get Southern Congresspeople to buy into his economic proposals, refused, even after being pushed by many black activists, to advocate for explicitly an anti-lynching bill. This is him speaking in 1934. If I come out for the anti-lynching bill now, Southern congressmen will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. I just cannot take that risk. It was almost a zero-sum proposition between whether or not to regulate white racial terrorism or to save the country from the Great Depression. In the meantime, you have African Americans who are working through backdoor channels, activists like Mary McLeod Bethune, pictured here with Eleanor Roosevelt, trying to find ways to push the president and push Congress to continue to bring pressure to bear on Southern politicians and local authorities to keep the lynching problem under wraps. The other issue, of course, was that African Americans, many of whom lost their homes during the Great Depression, were written out of many of the protections of the New Deal. For instance, you didn't have organizing allowed for agricultural workers or domestics, when other kinds of labor protections were afforded to other corners of the economy. So Mary McLeod Bethune and a number of other African Americans were part of what was called, at the time, Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. And their job was to try to find ways to allow African Americans, again, in the context of Jim Crow America, to have access to government programs on a strictly segregated basis. And it was the necessary piece of segregation that made it so difficult for so many of the mainstream black leaders across the country to be considered uniformly allies of civil rights. One critic, George Streeter, a labor organizer, writes W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935 and likens blacks in government under Jim Crow to the chiefs who are helping sustain indirect rule under Britain's Africa. Well, not all these black bureaucrats behave precisely as Britain's Nigerian chiefs and priests. There was a certain utility to the black presence within the federal government, where they were supposed to try to give the benefits of farm subsidies, other kinds of housing protections to African Americans, but always, without question, on a segregated basis. The profitability of segregation. The centerpiece of Jim Crow federal policy was the housing provisions of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration. Now, some of you have seen this has gotten traction in the press, over the last couple years at least, through writings by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm actually part of a team of researchers that's now digitized all of the maps that are available in the federal repository of these redlining policies that you can go to. Mappinginequality.com. I'm happy to give that again at the end. Mappinginequality.com. You can find every available redlining map for the country. Now, this is a little bit in the weeds, so forgive me for a moment. I just want to be sure that we get this very clear. Now, you have a series of colors that are corresponding with what basically constitutes mortgage risk. My guess is most of the folks in here have applied for some kind of credit, whether it be a mortgage or a credit card or something that had an interest rate associated with it. Now, what made a risky neighborhood was oftentimes racially determined. And if you were in one of these red areas, the first thing that would be allowed to happen is you would be allowed to lose your home. You would not get any government bailout from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And if you wanted to buy a piece of property, you could not get financing or a loan to actually buy real estate in a way that would allow you to basically have a new piece of property. Each grade corresponded with a set of assumptions. An A neighborhood was new, all white, non-Jewish, and in demand in good times and bad. And this is taken directly from the federal underwriting manual. B neighborhoods were still desirable, stable, and some Jewish presence, right? C neighborhoods are definitely declining or in danger of black in-migration. Those are C neighborhoods. D neighborhoods are areas, quote, in which the things taking place in C areas have already happened, unquote. Again, taken directly from the manual. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, and that's always the key to mortgage risk, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in value. So one of my colleagues has just coined the term the one house rule. In the same way you have the one drop rule concerning being black. If you have one drop of black blood, you're black. If you had one black house on the block, your whole neighborhood was a black neighborhood. Okay. And this is the way that my hometown now, Baltimore, was carved up. You have here west and east Baltimore, and these are neighborhoods that are still very much downwardly mobile. And in fact, West Baltimore, at the time that this was taken, was actually a majority white ethnic community. It was almost on a fast track to being an all-black community by virtue of the denial of mortgage availability. Make no mistake, even when a neighborhood was considered to be risky at the level of credit, it was considered to be extraordinarily profitable at the level of simply generating revenues. Now, understand, if anybody in here owns a piece of property, a rental property, in the 21st century economy, it's considered to be a sound investment if you can yield between 4 and 6% return on your investment. In 1970s Baltimore, Maryland, at the height of the urban crisis, landlords would leave their properties vacant and not even tend to them at all unless they were fetching between 10 and 15% return on their investment every year. In the heart of Jim Crow America, housing of this quality, whether it be in areas like Detroit, St. Louis, Miami, or Baltimore, were fetching between 24 and 33% return on investment every year, sometimes as high as 66% return on investment. Now, it doesn't take a math whiz to know that after a couple of years, you're basically pocketing 100% profit. And as a feature of segregation, many white landlords and some of their black counterparts found ways to fleece a confined tenant class that, because of racial terrorism, because of redlining, had no options at all in terms of where they would live. Now, has anybody here ever taken a child to Disney World? Quick show of hands. Okay. Now, I have 3 little ones, ages 9, 6, and 3. We haven't been to Disney World yet, but I know when we go to Disney World, I'm going to be very reluctant to want to buy too much once I get inside the gates. Because once you walk through those gates, every possible thing you can imagine, food, merchandise, Mickey ears, are going to be far more expensive than they would otherwise be if you bought them online or outside, right? Having a confined population that can't get back out of those gates creates a gouging situation. Living in Jim Crow America was the equivalent of living in Disney World without any of the rides, right? You literally have no choice in terms of where you buy your groceries, how much you pay for rent. On the white side of town in a southern city in 1949, you paid about $17.50 a week for hotel accommodations. You paid 50 cents more, or $18 a week, for these kinds of accommodations on the black side of town. And oftentimes had to share it with 3 and 4 or 7 or 8 counterparts just to make the rent, right? This was the day-to-day life. Now, in response to this problem, again, the entrepreneurial class, the political class, is negotiating for public housing projects. They're trying to find a way to provide a public option, in effect, for this gouging economy, always done on a segregated basis. So the housing projects that now dot much of the country, that some of which were built in the 60s, some of which were built in the 40s or the 30s, many of them were deliberately developed on a segregated basis. The Liberty Square housing project was part of a Negro resettlement plan in suburban Miami, just as one example. Now, in popular culture, all this negotiation, of course, has the backdrop of good old-fashioned Gothic nostalgia. Gone with the Wind is a Depression-era film, capturing the ways in which many African Americans are still dependent on their white counterparts. So language about the federal government and the New Deal is actually being shadowed by this kind of portraiture, right? This understanding that, well, the good old days are the ones in which you didn't work through the federal government, you didn't have government interference, you had a one-on-one relationship, an intimate relationship with somebody who looked after you. This is, again, one of those undersides of white popular sovereignty. Don't let the government regulate the relationship between white folk and their darkies, right? Because what we really know is that We, the paternalists who own the homes and who set the agenda politically, are the ones who are really looking out for your best interests. And so much pushback against the New Deal was about not compromising the Old South relationship between whites of property and power and many of their black charges. If you could not control the movement of black folk or their political aspirations, you tried to control their movement, excuse me. So around the country, again, you see massive efforts to exclude African Americans, again, North and South. This is simply a sign from Detroit, 1942. The actual land that many black communities sat on, particularly if they were developed in the late 19th century, became increasingly valuable as the Jim Crow era proceeded. So one thing that needed to happen if you had your black mammy, of course, was close proximity. You wanted to have her not too far away. If your child got sick, you need someone to come tend, mammy's right around the corner. Now, as the cities are growing and changing, these black districts, hemmed in by segregation, begin to sit on some of the most valuable downtown property in cities around the country. The Central Negro District, pictured here in 1949, was on pristine property in the middle of South Florida. Again, a neighborhood or a part of the country that's always booming and busting in terms of its real estate economy. You can see here the Central Negro District. Just across the waterway here is Miami Beach. Down here you have the golf course, hospital. Further still would be the airport, Orange Bowl Stadium, and so forth. Now, the visions of development in this one city alone were basically about trying to unmake the ghetto and turn it into a piece of effective travel infrastructure. Now, why am I telling you all this? We're going to get to a point in the story not too far down the road where bigger infrastructural projects, like Interstate Highway kind of big, are being used to clear black neighborhoods. Some of you know this story. Understand that this is actually dated back into the late 30s and early 40s, where the designs on slum clearance were already being put forward. But there's a problem. As a consequence of Jim Crow's profitability, you can't touch this neighborhood without going through a very well-funded group of lobbyists, most of whom are white, landlords who are controlling the ability of these cities to basically condemn or not condemn. Across the country, white landlords are blocking efforts to redevelop and change the face of the Jim Crow city. And they're making arguments about being the ones who are protecting black interests. They're actually drawing from the same reservoir of cultural utterances about having the good old folks' interests in mind. We're protecting them from the bulldozer. And in some cases, they were actually correct. So most development actually happened on the suburban fringe. This is why actually you have Levitt towns and suburbs around the country. You could not deal with the more expensive urban real estate, so instead you build segregated infrastructure out in the countryside, on farmland, for instance. And it's a place where you actualize your consumptive dreams of post-war America. Now we're moving you into the 1940s and the post-war period, an era of consumption. You have a home that is totally laced with all of the modern amenities. You have women whose lives are supposed to be made easier by modern appliances. And if you have enough money, you can then, of course, take your vacation in Miami, right? All of this was part of the social contract of post-war prosperity, and all done on a segregated basis. Many of these seemingly vacant lands, however, were not vacant at all. One of the things that happens in the 1940s and early 50s is that small rural enclaves that existed in the hinterlands of America were being unmade by massive suburban development. This is one episode that actually no one knew about because it was only told in rumor and innuendo and in the very confined whisper spaces of elderly black women's historic preservation groups. As part of my research for the first book, I did field work where they were telling these stories about neighborhoods that were being taken in the post-war period by police, redevelopment, bulldoze, and oftentimes happening during very cataclysmic events like a rainstorm, for instance. The residents of Railroad Shop in 1947 were thrown out during a rainstorm. Some of the folks who could negotiate to keep their home had their physical house removed from the ground and put on a flatbed truck and moved 15 miles away to another corner of the region, where they were then subsequently blown away by the hurricane of 1947, right? This is a piece of gentrification that doesn't really make it into our common understandings about segregation and how it functioned. Now, there were allies, and this is really important. because the allies that oftentimes tried to prevent these displacements or build new black-only infrastructure were in many instances, again, white entrepreneurs. White entrepreneurs. We don't think much about the coalitions of segregated America being about capital, but they absolutely were. And so you had developers in Chicago, in Louisiana, the development of Pontchartrain Park, again in areas around the kind of fringe South like Miami, building these all black enclaves. And these, again, were spaces where the dreams of post-war prosperity were supposed to be actualized. Playgrounds and spaces for modern consumption, green spaces for your children to play. Hopefully, good schools moved out of the degradations of Jim Crow education. But all of this is part of the aspiration of Afro-America, and all done on a segregated basis by way of negotiation between elites on the opposite side of the color line. Inside of these spaces, you had the hope, at least, to replicate some of the benefits of bourgeois white American life. This is one image I use with my classes a fair amount because it's so layered, you have a lot going on. Very quickly, all it is a group of teachers. Now, to be a teacher in black America, as many of you know, in the 1950s, was basically to be part of the middle class. We tend not to think about teachers today as being part of like the solid middle class, but if you had government employment and good benefits and you had a certain kind of social standing, you were part of the middle class. And teachers were absolutely part of black America's black bourgeoisie. And you see them here, dressed up for a dinner party with Billie Holiday. She's got a very expensive dress, I believe that's taffeta, with a toy dog. She's wearing pearls. And their proximity to this kind of celebrity gave all of the women in the picture a certain kind of meaning. You can see it on their faces, how important it is to have her there in that space. And I actually do a very close reading of this picture. But in the interest of time, all that you need to know is that this is actually a small tea house that's in suburban black America in the mid-20th century. And here you have the servant, who is there to just provide a little bit of help to offload the labor that's normally associated with simply being black and female in America. She's not a mammy per se, but she's certainly part of the day-to-day luxuries that many elite African Americans were trying to afford at this time, again, under the fog of Jim Crow. The other big side of this is that many of the landlords who were defending black neighborhoods, and to be very clear, their own economic bottom line from redevelopment, were also investing in building Jim Crow infrastructure on a leisure basis. Hotels, black college football games, all of this was a fixture of life in the Jim Crow South. We tend not to think about what it would mean to have blacks and whites attending a college football game together, 1947, 1948, segregated seating to watch Alcorn State or Florida A&M playing each other. But this is exactly what happened. And you would have, as part of the event, the black police force parade out under the color guard. The black cops couldn't actually arrest anybody who was white in the city. They could only arrest black folk. But you had to have them there to demonstrate that this was a community that knew how to maintain their own streets and generate a certain kind of safety and economic security. At the foundation of this, of course, were always the white businessmen. And I want to just bear down for a second to speak about one who, takes up a very important piece of the story in my first book. This is a man named Luther Brooks. He's born in southern Georgia. He actually migrates with the Black Great Migration from rural to urban America. We tend not to think about the fact that many of the urban forms of rental culture that existed in cities around the country was simply a transplant from southern rural Jim Crow America. Black folk moved and white entrepreneurs moved right along with them. Luther Brooks was one of these characters, right? He was initially managing a tenant farm and did turpentine farming in southern Georgia, migrated during the Great Depression into Miami. And he was a classic white paternalist. He basically believed that as he was harvesting rents on the one hand, he could help to generate appropriate color-only infrastructure with the other. I get my money from Negroes, I owe it to them to help them. Luther Brooks was someone who you could see on a regular basis in all black civic spaces, nightclubs, in churches. His office bonded rental agency was the home of an all-black radio station. He used all of his business ties in the black community to basically buy his cars, to print all of his ephemera. He was an engine of prosperity in Afro-America. White, rural, southern Georgia man. This is him pictured with the head coach of Florida A&M's football team, for whom he bought this gray blazer. Now we know he bought it because there's a letter from the coach to Luther Brooks, dated 1956. I won't go into it all in total, but simply it's written to Brooks's black public relations director. He was smart. He had a public relations guy. This letter is to thank you again for your kindness to me during my recent visit to Miami. I have just written your boss, that's Luther Brooks, capital B, that there are not many coaches who find themselves completely fitted with a brand new wardrobe, certainly not after a defeat. So his team lost the game, but a high point was the gift he had gotten from Luther Brooks. Here's Brooks donating again to a nursery, $1,000, so that you could actually have daycare where there otherwise wasn't any, right? Segregation in place of exclusion. Here is a list of foodstuffs being given to all of Luther Brooks's residents by the white landlords for whom he is managing their property. Brooks was an absolute commercial genius. He never owned any of the rental property he managed. He was basically a subcontractor. If anybody had problems with the deplorable condition of his housing, and it was deplorable, they'd have to take it up with the landlord, who was in some mysterious place in New England or somewhere in Texas, somewhere in northern Florida, maybe Miami Beach. He never actually touched any of the deeds. He simply collected the rent. In this case, a man by the name of Abe Schoenfeld was the one who actually owned it. And Schoenfeld gave chicken, cranberry sauce, cake, peas, corns, beans, loaf of bread, all of these items of holiday cheer for his tenants. Again, another piece of Jim Crow's material culture. The world of the Klan, of course, could not be sustained deep into the post-World War II period, largely because you had a number of important innovations in the realm of social science and cultural studies that denied at all the notion that blacks were biologically inferior. You had the problem of Nazism on the world stage that made it very difficult to sustain overt white supremacy as a feature of American life after World War II. Southern governors and entrepreneurs knew that investment in their small corners of the country would be hard to come by. People were worried about hate crime. So this confluence of factors made it very difficult for groups like the Klan to basically remain in power, politically, economically, or otherwise. Now, please be clear. You could not be a police officer in almost any city in America, North or South, in 1922, 23, 24, if you were also not a member of the Ku Klux Klan. They were an organized urban outfit. They had open parades and the whole mess. By the time you get to the late 1940s, the Klan is basically, discredited. You're not allowed to wear hoods in public. Cross burning is now illegal. All of the spirit of kind of moderate thinking had basically carried over to try to purge the Klan's power. However, there is still an underlying sense of what makes for acceptable practice as it concerns segregation. As black populations were expanding, many whites were beginning to push back. This is 1951. As a property owner in Miami, will you please help us in our fight to protect our homes from infiltration of the colored race? Signed, Anna Norcross, 751 Northwest 63rd Street. This was a telegram written to the governor of Florida, Fuller Warren. This one has slightly more colorful language. Don't want nigger neighbors in Edison Center. Let's get them out or else riot. Signed, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Coleman, 1052 Northwest 65th Street. Again, you could have this kind of language and send it to a major executive of your state and not have to basically hide your face in 1951. It was still very much part of the common ways in which people talk. You heard this kind of language in court proceedings, in government documents. This was not beyond the pale just yet, even as the Klan was being marginalized and demobilized. In response to inaction from Southern governors about the creeping Jim Crow segregation, the creeping black populations into white neighborhoods, you had, of course, racial violence. North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, the bombing that scattered across the American South after World War II. You know famously, of course, the bombing of 4 little girls in Birmingham, right? This is a consequence of military training that was earned during the fighting of World War II. Veterans coming back with explosive skills and literally creating a war front at home. In many instances, the people who were fighting against these white terrorist attacks were black veterans who also had military training. They were running patrols through black neighborhoods. It's a lesser known story of post-war America that the war absolutely came home in the form of racial terrorism and the battles between black and white veterans around housing across Jim Crow America. This, of course, was terrible for business. So you had to find a way to check the racial violence to keep investment coming into the South. So more reason to basically moderately revise Jim Crow's culture. Economic pressures, new weapon in the South. As you move into the late 1950s, some of the old-time language was still there, but it was very clear that the culture was changing to the point where in 1951, 52, you could proudly affix your name to a telegram using very hurtful language. In 1957, you could protest with a placard, but if the photographer came up, you wanted to cover your face. Right. I just love this picture, in part because it does what some of Jim Crow's language does, which is it collapses the distance between the present and the past. We have very few images, color photos of Jim Crow America, but there's something about seeing the vibrancy of Jim Crow life that helps us feel like we're not that far removed from it, right? The South was still trying to grow in terms of its leisure options, in terms of its white-collar employment, in terms of providing tax cuts for new business, and Jim Crow was still there in many corners that were not touched by the progressive impulses of a modernizing South. Some of you know, of course, that the Civil Rights Movement, much of its purpose was to go town by town, region by region, state by state, basically bringing negative publicity to the problems of disenfranchisement, to the problems of profiteering, to the problems of racial terrorism, because you simply couldn't have an edict come down from Washington and say, we shall now have an end to Jim Crow. Right? This had to be done on a very piecemeal basis. So areas like Mobile, Alabama, deep into the 1950s, we're not going to see any progress anytime soon, right? White only, colored only. Jim Crow's afterlife. After the pushing of civil rights legislation and a genuine moral shaming of the country, the language, the old language of Jim Crow really didn't have a place in American society. And once you enter the 1970s and the 1980s, you see a very clear effort to use other kinds of instruments, really infrastructure, to do the old work of segregation. The first black mayor elected in the 20th century was a man by the name of Carl Stokes, pictured here on the cover of Newsweek. And he simply tries to speak to this effort to revise the old language of Jim Crow. America no longer talks about spics, wops, and niggers, but rather talks about density and overcrowding of schools, etc., to achieve the same purpose. You could use infrastructural development and progress in large land re-engineering schemes to maintain the same kinds of color lines that used to only be held by a sign in a train station waiting room. The problem, of course, with actually executing many of these projects fell in many instances on the city administrators themselves. Carl Stokes famously tried to find a way to sustain urban renewal and make it an equitable process. But of course, many African Americans who were buying property and owning property cheek by jowl with the white landlords who were profiting from Jim Crow were caught in the crosshairs of progress and having their investments, many of which were lifelong investments, liquidated quite unfairly, right, as a result of the bulldozer moving through Afro-America. At the same time, many people were talking about urban renewal and these new projects as being explicit instruments of integration and desegregation. This is, again, just one headline. Urban Renewal Project to Encourage Integration, 1967, right? Save Urban Renewal. Coconut Grove Committee for Slum Clearing. This was an interracial civil rights group that believed that you could use redevelopment as a way to launch people from the slums that they were generating so much money for landlords with into new suburban opportunities. Miami's Central Negro District, which I pictured earlier, covered by a massive interchange that displaced some 40,000 people. Okay. Many of the folks who lost their homes were not being paid anything close to what the market value of their houses were. Landlords, on the other hand, oftentimes who had political inside information, were building concrete rental properties directly in the path of the expressway before they could then be knocked down and cash out. Because if you had a redevelopment project in place, you got more money for a rental property than for one that you owned and lived in. They paid you not just the value of your house or the land it was on, but the projected profits for X number of years if it was an income generating property. In the meantime, suburban America, the promised land for Afro-Americans in the wake of these redevelopment projects, became places of profound downward mobility. Many landlords who simply got their properties condemned, got zoning variances, and got their rental properties relocated directly into those old 1950s era's black suburbs that held so much promise. Liberty City, that had a riot in 1968, is just one example. Watts is another example. Atlanta Summerhill neighborhood as another example. Black suburbs where there literally was a suburban crisis. 1968 riots, right in the wake of green lawns and ranch-style housing. We tend not to think about the riots in black suburbs, but they're absolutely the predominant place where you see unrest. Ferguson, Missouri is not an urban community, right? So much of what then goes into the cultural performance of progress means demonstrating that you still have the good old-fashioned interracial coalitions and negotiations. After, in this case, the Miami community was bulldozed to make way for I-95, they had an elaborate ceremony for the building of an under-expressway park, and it had to absolutely be attended by members of the NAACP, pictured here. All three of these individuals, Atherley Range, Edward Graham, and Theodore Gibson, were also landlords, incidentally. An echo of an older form of black politics. The black entrepreneurial class gets to speak for the masses, right? They built a park under the expressway in response to the riots in the suburbs. It's a moment of good old-fashioned Sunbelt congratulations. The park is actually named after Atherley Range. It's still there in Miami, by the way. This is 1969. This is how the park was discussed in the black press, just so we're clear. Great idea, Commissioner Range. No one actually talked about the environmental hazards of a park being under the expressway, for instance. And just as a point of irony, and I love pointing this out, the very page on which the story of the Under Expressway Park is being portrayed, this is in the black newspaper of record, you find a nice fat quarter-page ad from Luther Brooks, right, who incidentally moved many of his operations for property management simply out to the suburbs. He followed black migration one more time, right? If I'm to enjoy a better life, others must live better too. That's here at the bottom of his advertising. These are all of his rental offices. Brooks made about $640,000 a year in revenue for his company. He had boats and houses across the region. He actually became a mayor of his own town called Islandia that he basically had 14 residents for. He had it on his own, and he eventually cashed out to the National Park Service. That gave him another massive infusion of capital for the property. I'm going to go ahead and just wrap up with a final point about white flight and kind of afterlife, and I really don't, it's going to only take me just one more minute. The move of people out to the suburbs was oftentimes driven by demands for privatization, away, none of the language of explicit Jim Crow, but more about exclusivity. We want to pay for the amenities that we have that are private. Language of private became in place of the language of whites only. Concerns about busing were obviously about concerns of reshaping the geography that had been built during the urban renewal era. And how do you actually cross these lines of segregation? You do so with busing. That creates conflict. So the issues around busing are clearly going to animate people. And again, the language of rights and who the people are. Whites have rights, being a very clear piece of how people were arguing for their own stake in the system. Very quickly, this is just an admission from Lee Atwater, 1981, again, talking about the language and where the language of Jim Crow went. Okay, I'm going to quote this at length before I wrap up. Now, this is, they actually get him on tape. He has a hot mic. He doesn't know it, right? And some of you know this story. Y'all aren't quoting me on this now, are you? No, says the reporter. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is black get hurt worse than whites. We don't want to cut this. It's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger nigger. Any way you look at it, race is going to be on the back burner. Now, hopefully, I don't have to connect the dots for this audience to know that this is pretty much where we are right now, right? I'm going to skip this just as a way to move things along and simply end with this piece to be very clear. Even as you have a Republican strategist talking in these terms about the racial language, the iconography of the old politics, the we the people politics, is still very much part of the conversation as well. This is a very famous image, Shepard Fairey's image of Hope Barack Obama. He won the election, as you know, in 2008, and it was seen by many to be a breakdown of the way that government was supposed to function. And so in response to the breakdown, you have to have a reassertion of we the people. Some of you may remember in the wake of the healthcare debacle, it was all about what the American people want. The American people don't want this, the American people don't want that. Many GOP reps were talking only about the American people in very general terms. It is therefore should not surprise us that in passing the legislation that seemingly was government overreach, it also created a need to reassert white popular sovereignty by way of the lynching tree. This is the people reclaiming their government. This is an image, a meme taken from emails that were hacked from Republican strategist offices in 2012 as they were trying to run the campaign to unseat Obama from the White House. Eyes shut, head tilted, no power, right? Now, I'm going to close there and simply say that I really appreciate your attention, and I really would hope that we can have a conversation about the many afterlives of Jim Crow. I just kind of gave you, a quick sample, or maybe a not so quick sample, but I really am looking forward to your questions, and I do, again, thank you for your time. Right. So that's an image from suburban South Florida, and one of the things that made South Florida such an important location was that it was the place that many black celebrities stopped on their way into Latin America and the Caribbean. So it was kind of a lesser known crossroads of the black diaspora, and especially in the mid to late 20th century, where you had many more opportunities for black performers to basically reach wider audiences. So Sammy Davis Jr. and Red Fox and a number of other kind of icons were constant fixtures in these small, intimate settings in and around suburban Miami, because they basically would come in from New York or elsewhere. You couldn't get direct flights from like New York to Havana, right? So you would stop in Miami, spend a day or two there, and then continue on into the Caribbean. So you have people like Muhammad Ali, for instance, who was, famously, who trained in Miami and who was, made a certain amount of home there. Also living among the suburban black communities in and around Miami. So Billie Holiday was one of several folks who was part of the nightlife in the city. And just as a kind of quick aside, because of the racism and zoning in the city, many black spaces were in fact more diverse and more kind of star-studded than their white spaces, meaning that Miami Beach at the time had zoning laws that basically made it hard to sell alcohol legally after a certain time of night, basically around just after midnight. But those laws didn't apply on the black side of town, so you basically had after-hours, jam sessions that would run deep into the evening, where you get people like Billie Holiday literally, performing on an open mic night, right, in a very small kind of cafe. And this is part of the folklore of Black Miami in particular, that celebrities were oftentimes so close to them. So I started working on this as a graduate student in the summer of 2003. And the book was, A World More Concrete in this instance, was published and submitted for final publication in the summer of 2013. So it was every bit of 10 years. For those who, let me say this. The 20th century is a very well-covered era in American history, right? So to have anything new to say oftentimes takes a lot of very granular work. Now, I had a number of very fortunate breaks. Like for instance, being able to find the papers of Luther Brooks as a property manager, literally in an archive. And the papers were housed in a place called the Black Archive of South Florida. Like it actually is in this space. And they're all there. And he has scrapbooks of all the things that he did to basically help the community. And then, I had a 2,000-page oral history collection that I found that was already transcribed, that were collected in the wake of the highway story and the displacement. So again, these folks who were talking about everyday life under Jim Crow and what was lost, that was available for me to use as a source. As about halfway through the project, the digital turn happened in research. And so many sources became available that were not available before. I had, for instance, images from the black press that were, would otherwise had to been found by very, day-to-day kind of reading of the daily or the weekly presses that were now made keyword searchable. There were, one example was a television directory of a film called Miami Condemned, which was literally an investigative report done in the early 1960s going into the slum properties themselves and interviewing tenants and the owners, doing gotcha journalism in the early 1960s. And there, I actually found Luther Brooks on camera talking and was able to kind of give more of a sense of him as a person as a result of this film being digitized and available. The last thing I'll say about this is when I was working through this, I'm an avid Facebooker, and I was basically looking for a way to use social media in a kind of productive way, because it can be a huge distraction, right? There's a photo of Luther Brooks having a softball team that he sponsors, 1948-49. In the picture is a small boy, a small white child named Leo Barfield, or Leonard Barfield. So I enter Leonard Barfield's name in Facebook just to see what would happen. And it brings up a picture of, an elderly man at this point, or close to an elderly man, who is, looks similar to the boy in the picture. So I sent him a note. I said, would you happen to be the nephew of a person I'm writing about named Luther Brooks? And he said, why, yes, I am. Then he said, if you'd like to, I can put you in touch with Luther Brooks's daughter, who's still alive, and his son-in-law, who was the accountant for Bonded Collection Agency. Within a day, I'm on the phone with the man who's managing the books for the property management company of this Jim Crow city from 50 years ago. And he's proceeding to tell me about all of the ways in which they're making their money, they're building ties into the black community, they're doing all of these things. And there's one point at which on the phone, you have to kind of warm up to these things. This is one of the fieldwork strategies you learn, when you're interviewing people and talking with them. You don't just ask right away about like the money. You kind of work your way in there. So it took about 2 hours on the phone, and I was like, yeah, just incidentally, could you give me a sense of how much money, the kinds of properties were generating that Brooks was managing? And Mr. Barfield, who again didn't miss a beat, was like between 25 and 33%. Now his wife was on the phone, knows how this sounds. And she interjects almost immediately. She's like, well, I really don't know if it was that expensive. And he cuts her off. He says, Margie, I managed the books for 14 years. I know what I'm talking about. Just kind of wrote it down. So it's an excellent question. Segregation is the policy-driven separation of people for reasons having to do with race, primarily having to do with race. And it's hard now to appreciate and see what the policies are that are driving segregation. And so, in the interest of time, I didn't kind of run a whole catalog of things down. You have a follow-up question? No, but it's the most profitable. It's the most profitable. So we have a kind of class segregation, right? So one of the things that happens, for instance, is if you look at black and white wealth, okay? There's been a lot of research on this. Poor whites tend to be able to live closer to their wealthier white counterparts. You can't see poverty as easily in many instances when it's white poverty as you can when there's black poverty, right? So what you have is a kind of, you see this for instance in school segregation cases, where middle class whites and poor whites can oftentimes belong to the same schools without it inciting a kind of panic selling or a white flight that may then cause property values to go down. In contrast, many African Americans who have resources, who are middle class, again think about our old teachers, cannot in fact live in neighborhoods where they can generate the kinds of equity and wealth that even their poorer white counterparts have. So just to give you one quick example, whites who make $30,000 a year live in neighborhoods that are the same quality as African Americans who make $100,000 a year, right? The black and white wealth gap is about 7-fold difference between what blacks can generate and what whites can. So one of the real challenges for many affluent African Americans is what do they buy and where do they buy it? And how many black folk can be around them until they experience a kind of downward mobility. I'm actually writing about this for a new book project. I'm following my grandparents from the Caribbean to the UK in the 1950s, then to the US in the 1960s and 70s. And my grandparents were a frontier family in every single neighborhood they moved into. They were the first black family on the block in Kensington. They were in the UK. They were the first black family on the block in New London, Connecticut. They were the first black family on the block in Miramar, Florida. And every time they made a move, it took about 5 or 6 years before the neighborhood then started to turn. And by the time they got to Florida in the early 1970s, they bought a house for about $70,000. And after 20 years of paying mortgage like clockwork, they only paid $9,000 off the principal. Because they had to refinance, property values weren't going up, they had high interest rates, right? So segregation through race provides a kind of instrument for generating and still creating these kinds of niche markets. I'll give you one other last example about this, and this has to do with basically the way that rental property works, okay? Landlords and other kinds of predatory entrepreneurs, they're watching, the same way they were watching in the 1930s about the black migrations into cities or the migrations out of cities into suburbs, they're always watching to see where you have concentrations of black folk, because therein lies a market. You have tax liens, for instance, if people are defaulting on their property taxes, they know which neighborhoods to target to try to scoop up properties on a quick, basically backdoor deal. In many cases, you have African Americans who don't know they've missed paying their property taxes, who simply get a notice to say, you thought you owned the house, but now you're renting from me, right? You have landlords who can chop up houses that they're buying for dirt cheap and getting zoning variances that turn homeowner communities into renter communities, because they know not the same kind of oversight, not the same kinds of regulation. You can make the argument, this is where the housing is most necessary. The point is, every time that you see a kind of physical marker of blackness, it basically causes things to happen where the zoning starts to break down and the regulations start to get real slack. You stop losing kind of regular road maintenance and these kinds of things. And the infrastructure literally changes around these populations in a way that then affects property values, right? So one of the things that has to basically happen now is we need deeper and richer policy regulations of predatory practices that caused the downward mobility of black communities consistently since the 1950s. Because we don't have regulation, we allow this kind of like Wild West free-for-all to have speculative markets that instead make it much more difficult for blacks to accumulate wealth. So that's the short answer to your question. Yeah. So I mean, there are a couple different things. I mean, obviously, you've got the dog whistling about race that are still going on, right? So it makes it very difficult to do things effectively when people aren't being very explicit about what the nature of the problems are. We were talking earlier about inner city as a term that simply, carries all kinds of negative connotations. Now, the irony about real estate, of course, is that inner cities are the most valuable real estate still to this day. And someone like Donald Trump knows that because he invests heavily in so-called inner cities, right? That's where all his hotels are, right? So one of the things that basically is now happening, there's a couple of things. You have what's called upzoning, which is a kind of effort to basically create investment in lesser invested communities. So you see this in areas like Little Havana in Miami. You see this in Brooklyn. Obviously, gentrification is a real problem in DC and New York and elsewhere. The other thing that you're seeing happening is a kind of disregard for owner communities or small renter communities to basically stay in place. So there's a constant sense that like if a neighborhood is downwardly mobile, the way you solve the problem is by getting rid of the residents. There's still a kind of clearance mentality whenever you have communities of color. So just to give you one kind of concrete example, in Baltimore City, there's a huge project on the docket now called Port Covington. And Port Covington has got $600 million in tax breaks. It's got all kinds of incentives. The CEO of Under Armour, remember the name of Kevin Plank, is really spearheading this in conjunction with black elites in the city to try to save the city's dwindling tax base, right? And what people aren't talking about is the inflationary impact that a massive project like Port Covington would have on smaller pockets of black owners in and around the city. Because the city of Baltimore is hoping to basically improve its tax base, right? It's offering tax cuts on the one hand, it needs to make that money back in another kind of column. So it raises the price of water bills 33% across the board, right? Then it expects the homeowners who don't get those corporate tax cuts to basically deal with the price hikes that then happen once all that property is reassessed, given its proximity to this new shiny project like Port Covington, right? So many old folks who live in these homes who may have already paid off the mortgage, all they have to do is pay that property tax, but on a fixed income, they might find themselves in a difficult position to make that note. When they can't pay their property taxes, they fall into default, oftentimes without their knowledge, and then it winds up again in tax lien court. Their lien is bought oftentimes without their knowledge. Then they go from being an owner to a renter. You follow? Right? So there's a relationship between this impulse to simply raise property values wherever we can, to hopefully generate taxes for city governments because they're giving corporate tax rates on the other hand, with no concern whatsoever for the small, atomized, unorganized homeowner communities that are historically occupying many of these inner city communities. So until we have a kind of, again, robust discussion about our tax policy, until there's a sense that we should not be offloading the expenses of urban development really onto the poor and onto those who don't have the kind of political capital to organize against it, and until there's a sense that we need to, in fact, think better about what it means to have an economy that's driven by and large by real estate, as opposed to by a much fairer progressive tax structure that actually brings taxation from the wealthy into the infrastructure that's so necessary, like the water infrastructure in Baltimore that's crumbling with clay pipes and all the rest of it, right? I mean, it needs to be paid for. But until we have that conversation, instead of the old conversation that, again, Lee Atwater and many other people were talking about, tax cuts as a way to protect the privileges of segregation, then it's not going to get better. Yeah, so the book itself, much of its resonance in the wider field is actually precisely on this issue. I mean, A World More Concrete does a lot of different things about Miami's own kind of location, Caribbean immigration, these things. But the black landlording piece is what really tends to shock people, right? Because Atherley Range, who I picture there with the Under Expressway Park, for instance, this investigative report that I found from this one was a later one, 1973, has camera crews going through property that she owns. And her tenant is there, a woman by the name of Rose Lee White, a small black woman, very poor, who's renting from Atherley Range. And she's showing the conditions of the real estate with holes in the ceiling, broken windows, and Range, who sits on the city council, is able to basically threaten her and say, you're gonna have to pay for all of these improvements that are necessary for this property, or I'm going to use my authority to condemn my own real estate and throw you out into the street, right? There's actually a very long and sordid history of black elite, many of whom are representing the same community in the halls of power, who are building their influence from rents they're harvesting from the black poor. Their wealth and their power is coming from getting those high profit margins that I mentioned earlier, because when you have a confined market like that, one of the ways that you basically actualize your own economic destiny is by taking advantage of it the same way that your white counterparts might. And so some of Luther Brooks's most loyal clients were black doctors, black lawyers, black ministers who worked on one level to actually demobilize black tenant organizing, while the white landlords who had their own lobby were making sure the legislation in the all-white state legislature was also favorable to landlords. So they've got a dance that they're doing, and I've been able to document some of this stuff by going into the meeting minutes and going into the proceedings, that you basically have this crude alliance between black folk who would never dream of embarrassing the race man of the neighborhood, the dominant minister or the physician who's representing them, by having a kind of tenant case, and the legislators, the good old boys up in Tallahassee and elsewhere, who are saying, you know what, why don't you go ahead and do something for us that's going to keep these feds out of our backyard, right? And this is how Jim Crow functioned. This is how it functioned. In fact, I've actually got letters from George Smathers, who's a Southern congressman, segregationist, dyed in the wool, to Ira Davis, a black dentist who owns property in not too great shape, basically saying, if you give me political dirt on my enemies from the street, I'm going to create things that are favorable to you. There was one African-American man in the entire city of Miami who had a loan that was underwritten by the Federal Housing Administration, and that was Ira Davis. Ira Davis, on a political favor because he was able to feed dirt to the Southern congressman who was managing these policies up in Washington. And in the meantime, they decided that that all-Negro police force that I mentioned to you before, their headquarters was going to be in Ira Davis's dental office. He actually ran it from his storefront shop. And he was considered to be the mayor of Black Miami, this one guy, right? So this kind of quid pro quo was, again, a constant feature. I have not, and I haven't been to Tulsa either. So I'm one of the other projects I'm working on is trying to do a general history of Black capitalism. My plan is to actually go to Tulsa to try to tell that story. Because, one of the things that, again, it comes out of this period is that there was this assumption, and again, one that we still hold very dear to, that commercial power or economic power was supposed to somehow lead to political power. Black folk believe this every time, and they still are peddling it, right? I mean, you don't have to look very far to find Jay-Z representing, some kind of political position, or the way that you make it in America by becoming LeBron James, right? We tend to believe that you get the authority to speak by virtue of having wealth, and that's as old as the Tulsa race riot, right? So part of what I'm trying to basically figure out is, one, what was the afterlife of a place like Tulsa, Oklahoma, after the riots occurred? But then also, I'm looking very much forward to getting to the exhibit at the Afghan Museum on the Mall, because those tickets are apparently very hard to come by, and I don't know anybody high enough up to get me in there. So if anybody wants to do me a solid, I'd appreciate it. Yeah. Okay, so a couple things. Obviously, I mean, if we're talking about the era, well, that's actually a good question. So if we're talking about the era prior to the Brown decision, obviously, you've got this notion that still separate could in fact be equal. And there was a moment roughly between the 19 teens and the 1950s where the effort was, again, not to desegregate, but to equalize Jim Crow. So you could make claims that, okay, we have a color only this or that, but you're not equalizing it. And you could get claims done to try to make good on the law of the land, the law of Plessy, right? On the ground, you had Black judges who were coming into the positions for the first time, 1950, 51, 52, and you hadn't seen a Black judge in the South since Reconstruction. That was part of this equalization moment. So one of the judges in the South, Lawson Thomas, who's a University of Michigan graduate, go Blue, and he is he's the first Black judge in the South since Reconstruction, but he's also a landlord, right? So he's one of these guys who basically is, and he's using, very clearly, he's using the bench as a way to simply morally uplift African Americans who are coming before him. He's not allowed to try whites, but so imagine something like Judge Joe Brown, right? That's kind of what it was like going to Lawson Thomas's court. He couldn't actually try any felonies. It was only misdemeanors. So everything he did was about basically disciplining Black folk who weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, right? That was kind of his job. So that was the role of the courts, municipal courts on the local level there. Now, in terms of the bigger story around the case law itself, and this is really important, the high water mark of housing regulation in this country is 1968. And you have the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but you also have a very important case called Jones v. Mayer. Jones v. Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R. And all Jones v. Mayer basically did was put teeth in the old civil rights law that was passed back in 1866, right? So you had a law in the books that was passed in the era of Reconstruction that people didn't really enforce, they didn't try to nationalize it. And so in the wake of housing discrimination cases, Jones v. Mayer basically said that all people of the country will have the same power as white Americans. This is the law of the 1866 law. The same power as white Americans to hold, transfer, acquire, and basically make real property. Now, as a result of the passage of Jones v. Mayer, that's when you start to get the threat of actually having law in the courts that would allow you to avoid things like racial steering, that would allow you to fight against the afterlife of racial zoning, that would create concerns and questions about the way that schools are being asymmetrically funded, for instance. So that's the big kind of moment. What happens after Jones v. Mayer, of course, is that the Department of Housing and Urban Development and a few other federal agencies that are trying to actually implement the decision get overwhelmed. Their staffs are cut back under Nixon, then again under Reagan, and they're inundated with basically 5-year backlogs or more, right? The other thing that basically happens is, again, it creates a new marketplace. So you say, okay, we can't really enforce the open housing mandates of the 1960s legislation, so now we're simply going to incentivize new investment. And the federal government is going to pay anybody who wants to use some of these new FHA instruments to basically provide loans now to African Americans that weren't really available before, but are still on a segregated basis. So what happens as a result of legislation in the courts, or precedents in the courts and legislation thereafter, is that you begin to line the pockets of bankers yet again by giving a federal policy that says you can raise the interest rates as high as you like and we'll just cover the difference. $1.8 billion in 1973 was paid strictly in interest payments to lenders that were charging higher interest rates to now venture the risk of providing mortgages in black communities that were redlined 50 years earlier. 40% of the budget of HUD went simply to paying bankers for the difficulty of lending in these neighborhoods. Now imagine what $1.8 billion would have done in the realm of actual housing reform, policy, and infrastructure. But that's not how capitalism works, right? That's it. Thank you very much.